From early on, working on Roman military history and Roman political history, you obviously come across Caesar a lot, and particularly for the military historian. His commentaries are unmatched in terms of detailed accounts of campaigns written by the man who's actually leading those campaigns. That obviously means there are huge biases involved, but nevertheless the detail, the sort of stuff he tells us, is not really matched by anything else that survives on that sort of scale. So I'd always had an interest in Julius Caesar, and if you study Roman history, he's clearly a key figure. It always struck me as slightly strange while I was an undergraduate that you got the impression scholars and students developed quite a strong opinion about Julius Caesar quite quickly, and they either really like him or really hate him. There didn't seem to be much middle ground. So he's a fascinating, intriguing figure, and coming to this biography, I wanted to write it as far as possible as if it were the biography of a 19th or 20th century general or statesman. Asking the same sort of questions, trying to follow the individual throughout their life. Now, obviously, there are simply not the sources to do this fully with a Roman figure, even someone like Julius Caesar. As a small example, we think he was born in 100 BC, but both the biographies from the ancient world, Plutarch and Suetonius, don't actually include the detail, the year in which he was born. So we know the date, we know it's in July, but we don't know which year. 100 BC works the best, but it does cause a few slight problems. So even something as basic as that, about someone as famous and as controversial and prominent as Julius Caesar, there isn't the hard facts where we can say with 100% certainty, this is what happened, this is when he was born. So it's very much about trying to ask the same questions, trying to adopt the same approach as you would if you were looking at someone more modern, but acknowledging the fact that the ancient sources won't let you do that in the same way, that there simply isn't the detail, that there's much we don't really know. But from that as well, the second thing I wanted to do was cover all his life in as much detail as it was possible to do, because there is a big tendency. There are some military studies of Caesar as a general, and they tend to neglect the politics. There are far more studies of Caesar the politician, Caesar the statesman, the great German ones by Gelzer and Meyer still stand up even though they're getting on in years now, and there have been others since then. Nobody had sat down and tried to write a biography that covered the military and political career of Julius Caesar in equal detail, and that beyond that tried to give as much weight as we could to every episode in his life. His early life is more difficult. We don't know much about his childhood. We don't know much about his early life. It's simply not there in the sources. So this becomes more of a mixture of the things we are told Roman aristocratic families in this era did when they had a baby, when they named them, when they raised them, how they did it, how they educated them. So you get that. You then come into his early life, you have the controversial, the stories of him being flammendialis, this ancient, archaic, rather strange priesthood that would severely have restricted his political opportunities in the future, though it would have given him considerable status in other respects that he occupies, but either there's debate over whether or not he's formally installed as flammendialis, and then Sulla strips him of the post, or whether he's never actually appointed. I suspect he probably was, but again, you can't be sure. And he's a hunted fugitive under Sulla, but probably not a very important one. There is another difficulty with Caesar. Everybody knows what he's going to do, and that was true of nearly everyone writing accounts in the ancient world. Even Cicero's letters that are at least contemporary with Caesar's life in some cases, and were written down before Caesar was murdered, were not published until after he had been and after the Civil War had broken out. So you have to be careful. There's a striking gap in Cicero's letters to Atticus in the months surrounding Julius Caesar's assassination, which, given that these were published when Caesar Augustus, Caesar's heir, had become the first emperor, you can't help wondering whether Atticus wanted something suppressed, that something embarrassing that was implied about his views or opinions expressed at that time, particularly as he'd done rather well. He'd married his daughter to Agrippa, so he'd got in very well with the new regime, much as Atticus had always managed to do. He was someone who stood back from politics but was always friends with everybody, and particularly that meant that he was always friends with the winners in some shape or form. So you have problems with this early life, but I've tried to cover it in as much detail as possible. I've tried to explain what we know, what we don't know, what we guess, and how we guess it. It's always, in books like this, I try to show you history with the scaffolding still in place. You know, how we go about studying the ancient world, understanding the Romans, understanding the Greeks, understanding anybody else, how the sources work, how we best look at them, how we best understand them, and the levels at which point we start to add conjectures, assumptions on top of what we can be more confident we really know. So Caesar's career is too detailed, too flamboyant to be described in a short video like this, but there's a lot of it, and it's a very good story. Whatever you think of him, Julius Caesar was clearly a remarkable man. Fiercely intelligent, very charismatic, extremely able. When he took over in Gaul, he didn't really have that much military experience, and yet he proves to be a commander of prodigious talent. And by Roman standards, he's probably had less military service than most people who take on a provincial command at that level. He's done a bit in Spain before, but other than that, it's fairly limited. And yet, he proves very good at it. And if you look closely at Cicero's letters, you don't get the impression that everyone thought when Caesar was off out there that he was going to do these wonderful things. Nobody really knew much about him. You know, they thought he'd win a victory, make some money, because that's what governors tend to do. But it may be in the background to the Civil War that Pompey never quite could take Caesar seriously, because Pompey has this proven record. He's been the great hero, the greatest general of his generation, perhaps of the Republic has ever had, and he's liked that status. And Caesar is the latecomer who starts his military career at a very advanced age, really, compared to Pompey, who's broken all the rules and done everything young. It's hard to accept that this man is somehow really good and maybe as good as you. And people are starting to talk about, well, maybe he's even better now. Perhaps as good as you once were, but you're not anymore. So there's a lot of politics in this. And you have to keep the personalities in mind, as well as the political ideas, because it matters what Pompey feels and what Pompey thinks. And it helps that we have a biography of him by Plutarch, and we get impressions of him from Cicero's letters. Cicero's letters give us this wonderful personal glimpse of the rumours, the stories, the gossips that were circulating in Rome at the time, the assumptions people made. Now, obviously, they're very biased by Cicero and his correspondents, what they think and their particular views. And you can sum this up. In older histories of this era, you will often talk about the struggle between the optimates and the populares. The optimates, the optimates, the best men. The populares, the ones seeking support from the people, from the mob. You can tell from those two names that this is very much a particular view of politics. Only people with immense self-esteem refer to themselves as the best men. Sometimes they call themselves the boni, the good, and dismiss their opponents as populist, popular, demagogues, all of this thing. They have support of the people, but it's the wrong people. And Caesar falls into that category, but we don't get so much from other points of view. You know, you have to remember the Senate is large, and not everyone sides with it. Again, another mistake in the Civil War is to talk of Caesar fighting the Senate. The majority of senators in that Civil War try to remain neutral, and most succeed. More support Cato, Pompey, and the others than support Caesar, and particularly more men from prominent families, but it's not by such a great degree as people can make out. And it isn't as simple as the Senate monolithically fights against Julius Caesar. But again, this is all assuming that we know that's what's going to happen all the way through. And as many of our ancient sources assume, that Caesar was always planning this. You know, he was a danger. All these stories, the dictator Sulla lets this teenager off, but warns people that, you know, there's many Mariuses in this one Caesar, that, you know, this is the kid to watch. He's dangerous. He's ambitious. He's going to destroy the Republic. That's all hindsight. And the more I looked at the detail, I don't think Caesar did intend that at all, but he is also sufficiently self-absorbed, sufficiently arrogant, sufficiently ambitious that he will not accept losing. He will always up the stakes. He is a gambler at heart. And the tragedy of the Civil War is that both sides think the other side will back down. If they keep raising the stakes, the other side will back down, or if they don't, they'll easily be defeated. So it's a story of politics, it's a story of war. There is a lot of detail on the Gallic campaigns. It's not a full history of those, but it's within the context of the biography as far as I felt I could go at the time, and also of the campaigns of the Civil War. And that's important. Some people are less interested in that side of things. They really only want to know about the politics. But again, if you're going to understand Caesar, you need to remember that he spends the last third of his life almost entirely on campaign. He fights a war pretty much every year. Major battle, major sieges, several operations in many cases. And that's bound to take a toll of someone physically, but it's also bound to influence the way they interact with others. When you're the commander of an army, it's a very different approach to being one politician among many in a senate. So it's important. Some people, as I say, didn't like this military context. They find that dull because they're not interested. There are probably others out there who are less interested in the politics and love the military stuff. But if you're going to understand Caesar, if you're going to do this as much the story of his life as you can and understand that life, you need to know what he is doing and where he is at any stage and for how long, and try and balance that out, not just simply dismiss campaigns in a few lines or a few paragraphs and forget what this really meant. So there's a lot there that helps, I think, to give a different impression of Caesar. So that was the aim within the book, but it's hard. Someone like Caesar did so much, you cannot do everything in absolutely exhaustive detail. And it does mean that you could extend the debate over his last few months, his dictatorship, and that last period when he's in Rome, to a book of this length quite easily. But again, that would distort the fact that those last few months, that they are largely known by sources written after Caesar was murdered, when his supporters were condemning the liberators, Brutus and Cassius and that lot, and saying, well, there was no need to murder Julius Caesar. You've killed him unnecessarily, and look at all the great things he would have done if you hadn't killed him. Whereas Brutus, Cassius and the others and their successors are saying, well, we had to kill Julius Caesar because look at all the terrible things he would have done if we had not killed him on the Ides of March. That's one thing about Caesar's story, it's never dull. It's packed full with gossip, with innuendo, with stories that you have to think about and balance and can't be sure whether or not they're true. Was he really having an affair with Cassius, his wife, in the months leading up to the assassination? The affair with Brutus's mother certainly seems to have such good sources that everyone accepts it as true and did so at the time and went on for a long period. So, this is a big story, and it brings in bigger characters as well who demand more attention, like Cleopatra, Steve, the most famous of Caesar's lovers, but Caesar had an awful lot of lovers. Mark Antony, not so much in Caesar's lifetime, but the young Gaius Octavius who will become Caesar Augustus has to feature as well. And people like Cicero and Pompey and Lucullus and Crassus. The late Roman Republic is packed full of these larger-than-life characters. Caesar is perhaps the most spectacular of them all, but it makes for a terrific story that at times sounds like soap opera, but it's all about trying to understand that, trying to do, as I say, a modern biography of the leading figure in this period, the key figure who shapes so much of what happens, the controversial figure of Caesar, who is flamboyant, who is charismatic, who is also ruthless and creates a lot of destruction, causes a lot of death, causes a lot of hardship. But again, you look at the Catos and the others and Brutus and Cassius and people who are no better and cause as much devastation. You come back in the end to Lucan's comment, the civil war happened because Pompey wouldn't accept an equal, nor Caesar a superior. And the more I think about it, in many ways that still holds true. But one thing you can say about the Romans in general, and Caesar in particular, they're never dull. So this is a really good story by any standards and well worth telling.